Before we begin, pay close attention. There's something Clara's father loves more than anything, except his daughter. Watch until the end, and see if you can figure out what it is. Comment your guess below. I'll reply and leave a heart if you get it right. The evening came down heavy over the plains, a bruised sky swallowing the last breath of sunlight. Dust hung in the air like ghosts of long-forgotten riders, and from the horizon came the echo of a single horse. Its hooves struck the earth slow and steady, like the ticking of a clock that counted down to ruin. They said when Weston Hale rode into town, debts were paid, one way or another. He was a man carved from the desert itself. Broad shoulders, jaw hard as stone, and eyes cold enough to stop a man's breath mid-chest. He owned cattle, land, men, and fear, but that day he came not for gold. He came for a name, Caleb Turner, a farmer. A man whose promises had dried out long before his crops ever did. Weston rode through the gate of the Turner Ranch just as the wind began to stir the wheat. The place looked abandoned, fences leaning, roof shingles peeling, the silence too thick to be natural. He dismounted, boots striking the dust, and waited. From inside the crooked doorway came a voice, soft, tired, and afraid. "My father's not here, sir." Weston turned. She stood there, framed by the dying light. A girl barely grown, her hair tangled from the wind, eyes as green as the river before a storm. Her dress was faded, her hands calloused, yet she held herself proud, like someone who'd been taught to stand, even when the world fell apart. "And who are you?" Weston asked, his voice low as thunder. "Clara Turner." His daughter, she swallowed hard. "If you've come for money, there's none left. The drought took everything." Weston's gaze swept across the barren fields. He already knew. He'd known before he came. Still, he had to say it. "Your father owes me more than any man west of the river. I gave him a chance. 10 months. He gave me silence." Clara's eyes shimmered, but she didn't beg. "He's sick, sir, bedridden. He meant to pay." You can what?" Weston interrupted. She hesitated. Her breath trembled. "Work it off. Whatever it takes." The wind carried her words between them, fragile, trembling, and brave. Weston stared at her, something burning slow in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he didn't want to collect. He wanted to understand, but duty was heavier than mercy. He had built his empire on both. "Pack your things," he said finally. "You'll come with me." Her lips parted. "Come with you?" "To where?" "To my ranch. You'll work until the debt is cleared. And my father. He'll have food. I'll send men to tend him." Clara's breath caught, half relief, half fear. Her father would live, but what would become of her? Weston turned his back to her and began to tighten his horse's reins. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled to breaking. "Sir," she whispered, "why would a man like you take pity on us?" Weston paused. The wind lifted the corner of his coat. His answer came quiet, almost to himself. "Because once, someone took pity on me." He mounted his horse, extended his gloved hand down to her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his voice softened. "Come with me." Clara looked at that hand, the hand of the man who could ruin her life or save it. And she made her choice. Slowly, she placed her small, trembling palm into his, and that was how it began. When she climbed up behind him, the sun finally disappeared behind the hills. The world turned dark, but for Clara Turner, and perhaps, though he didn't yet know it, for Weston Hale too, something began to glow quietly inside the night. As they rode away, the ranch faded into shadow, swallowed by the dust and distance. And somewhere deep in Weston's chest, a wall that had stood for years began to crack, one heartbeat at a time. They rode through the night, the moon trailing them like a silver ghost. Clara's arms were wrapped around Weston's waist, not out of trust, but necessity. The horse's muscles rippled beneath them, steady and powerful, carrying her farther from everything she'd ever known. When dawn finally came, the world bled into color, a soft blush of orange spilling over the hills. And then there it was, Hale Ranch. It was no ordinary ranch. It was a kingdom of fences, stables, and smoke rising from chimneys, A place where men worked hard and silence worked harder. Clara's eyes widened. This is where you live? Weston dismounted. Where I work, he corrected. And where you'll work too. She slid off the horse, her legs trembling. Everything about the ranch screamed order. The way the men stood when Weston passed, the gleam of the saddles, the sharpness of the air. Even the dust seemed to move only when allowed. The foreman, a scar-faced man named Briggs, approached. Boss, didn't expect you back this soon. I had a debt to settle, Weston said, handing him the reins. This is Clara Turner. She'll be staying here. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Another hand? Something like that, Weston said, his tone cutting the curiosity short. Clara stood small among giants. Every pair of eyes that passed lingered on her a moment too long. Whispers crawled through the air like snakes. Later, as Weston led her toward the big house, a structure of stone and wood polished to perfection, she couldn't help but whisper, "They look at me like I don't belong." Weston didn't stop walking. "They look at you because no one ever comes here without a reason." She frowned. "And my reason?" He opened the heavy front door. "To repay what your father couldn't." The interior of the house glowed golden under lamplight. Oil paintings hung on the walls, men on horseback, battlefields, rivers of smoke. Every corner smelled of leather and whiskey. It was beautiful but cold. "You'll stay in the East Room," Weston said. "Martha will bring you food and show you where to start tomorrow." She nodded, her voice small. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He stopped at the stairs, his hand resting on the banister. "Call me Weston." And with that, he disappeared upstairs, boots echoing like gunshots down a long, lonely hall. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the silence too strange. She sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill over the fences and barns below. Somewhere out there, men shouted, horses neighed, and a coyote cried into the wind. She thought of her father, alone, coughing, probably too weak to light the lantern. She thought of the debt and of the man who had brought her here. She hated him. But a small, dangerous part of her didn't. The next morning she rose before dawn. She found the stables herself and began cleaning without being told. Her dress was old, her hands blistered, but she worked with a quiet fury that made even the seasoned ranch hands glance twice. When Weston came down later, coffee in hand, he stopped at the door. He didn't say a word, just watched. She didn't see him at first. But when she did, she straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow. "You didn't tell me what kind of work you wanted done, so I figured this was a start." "You're not afraid to get your hands dirty," he said. "Fear doesn't feed people," she replied. He almost smiled, almost. From that day on, she worked harder than anyone. She helped in the stables, fed the horses, even mended torn saddles. She refused to rest, refused to break. And as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift, not just in the air, but in Weston Hale himself. He found himself looking for her in small ways, noticing when she laughed with the cook, when she tied her hair up under the sun, when her hands brushed against a horse's mane like she was made of gentleness the world had forgotten. One evening, after a long day, he found her by the corral, feeding his black stallion, a creature no one dared to touch. "He doesn't let anyone near him," Weston said, walking closer. "He's not mean," Clara replied. "He's just lonely." Their eyes met. For the first time, there was no anger there, only something deep and human. Weston took a slow breath. "You talk about animals like they're people. And you talk about people like they're debts." Her words cut sharper than a blade. Weston didn't answer, not because he couldn't, but because she was right. That night, Weston poured himself a drink in the quiet of his study. For years he'd built walls made of gold and fear. Now, a girl with torn sleeves and green eyes was breaking them without even knowing it. He thought of her words again and again. "You talk about people like they're debts." He looked out the window, into the night, and saw her lantern flicker from across the yard. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into something softer, something Clara could no longer name. At first, she had counted each sunrise like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. But soon she stopped counting. Life at Hale Ranch had its rhythm, hard, relentless, and honest. She rose before dawn, worked until the horizon turned orange, and fell asleep before the stars blinked twice. And Weston Hale watched it all. He'd built this empire with iron hands, a place where men obeyed and horses feared him. But Clara didn't fear him. She challenged him with her silence. She faced him with her eyes. When she passed, he felt it, a stillness that unsettled him more than any threat of violence ever had. He couldn't say when admiration turned into something deeper. Maybe it was the way she laughed once, unguarded, when the stable boy slipped into the mud. Or maybe it was the night she sang to herself under the stars, her voice quiet but enough to make even the restless wind pause. Whatever it was, it took hold of him like wildfire beneath snow. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the north, a violent curtain of rain and thunder that shook the earth. Men ran to tie down the cattle, shouting over the wind. Clara worked beside them, hair soaked, dress clinging to her skin. Weston saw her from the porch, lightning flashing behind her like she belonged to the storm itself.
"Clara, get inside," he shouted.
"The horses are panicking," she cried back. "If they break the fence, they'll scatter." Weston jumped from the porch, boots splashing in the mud. He grabbed a rope, ran to her side, and together they wrestled the frightened stallions into the barn. The storm howled around them, rain stinging, thunder cracking above like the sky itself was splitting in half. When the last gate slammed shut, Weston caught her arm. She was shaking, drenched, her breath quick and shallow. He led her inside, to the stable's warmth, where the smell of hay and horse sweat filled the air. "You could have been killed out there," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "So could you," she answered softly, pushing wet hair from her face. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, rain dripping from their clothes. The world outside raging and wild. Something flickered in his eyes. Something human, raw and forbidden. He reached up slowly, brushing a drop of rain from her cheek with the back of his finger. "You don't know what you do to me, Clara Turner," he murmured. She froze. The words hung in the air, trembling. "You brought me here to repay a debt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I think I'm the one keeping you alive." Weston stepped back, like the words had struck him. He turned away, running a hand through his soaked hair. "You don't understand what kind of man I am." "Maybe not," she said, "but I see the kind of man you're trying not to be." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not as a collector of debts, but as a man stripped of his armor. And in that barn, between the rain and the breathless silence, something sacred began to take root. The storm passed. The air smelled of wet earth and forgiveness. In the days that followed, Weston tried to distance himself. He buried himself in work, in ledgers, in whiskey, but nothing quieted the sound of her voice, or the image of her face when she looked at him without fear. At night, he'd stand by his window, looking toward the small guest cabin she slept in. Her lantern burned late. She always read old books she'd found in his library, stories of distant lands and impossible hopes. One night, he found himself walking to her door without meaning to. The lantern inside was still on. He knocked softly. "Clara," he said. "You awake?" "Always," she replied from inside. He hesitated. "Can I come in?" There was a pause. Then, yes, he opened the door. She sat at a small table, hair loose, wearing a white nightgown that glowed in the candlelight. A book rested in her lap. She didn't look surprised, almost as if she'd been expecting him. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said quietly. "You didn't," he nodded toward the book. "What are you reading?" "A story about mercy," she said. "A man who lost everything and found it again in love." Weston's jaw tightened. "Does he deserve it?" "No one does," she said softly. "That's why it's mercy." The silence between them was like gravity, pulling, inevitable. He sat down across from her, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the candle. "I don't believe in stories like that," he murmured. "Then you've forgotten how to live in them," she replied, their eyes locked. The room seemed to shrink, every sound fading except the rhythm of their breathing. Weston leaned closer, his voice deep as a prayer. You make me want to remember. Clara's heart trembled. Then remember, Weston, please. For a moment he wanted to take her hand, to let the world fall away. But something dark moved behind his eyes. He stood abruptly, breaking the spell. I can't, he said. Not yet. He turned and left, leaving her in the glow of the candlelight, her book open, her heart open wider. Weeks passed. But something inside Weston had shifted. He began to smile, just barely. The men noticed. The ranch felt lighter. He gave Clara less work and more freedom. She began teaching one of the ranch boys to read. She planted flowers near the main house. She even got the black stallion to bow his head when she approached, and though they rarely spoke of it, a quiet bond grew between them, one that didn't need words to exist. One evening, Weston found her by the river behind the ranch. The sun was setting low, painting the water gold. She stood barefoot, her skirt brushing the grass, humming softly to herself. He watched from a distance, unsure if he was allowed to step closer. But then she turned, smiled faintly, and said, "You can come closer." "The river won't tell anyone." He walked up beside her. The current whispered against the rocks. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "But lately, I don't know if I want to." He looked at her profile, the curve of her jaw, the way the light kissed her skin. "You could have a better life somewhere else." She turned to him. "Maybe, but not with a better man." Weston exhaled, the sound almost like a laugh. "You have no idea what kind of man I am, Clara." "I think I do," she said. "A man who came to collect a debt and found a soul instead." He didn't answer. He just stared at her, eyes burning, heart unarmored. Then, without thinking, he reached out and brushed her hand with his. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a promise. It was the beginning of both. That night, Weston lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the woman sleeping just across the yard, the girl who had walked into his empire of silence and made it breathe again. He knew it then. She was no debt to be collected. She was the reason he'd built all of this, even if he hadn't known it until now. The summer heat rolled over Hale Ranch like a fever that wouldn't break. Dust shimmered in the air. Cicadas cried from the mesquite trees, and every shadow felt heavy with things unsaid. To the men who worked there, Weston Hale had always been a man of power, firm, just, and feared. But lately, something in him had changed. His orders came softer. His anger came slower. And when he looked out across his land, his gaze always stopped in the same place, where Clara Turner worked among the horses, her laughter carrying over the fields like something that didn't belong to this harsh world. The ranch hands whispered about it, of course. A poor farmer's daughter living under the same roof as the richest man in the county. But Weston didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't care what anyone said. Until one morning, a letter arrived. It came with the stagecoach, sealed with red wax, a mark he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Weston took it to his study, shut the door, and broke the seal with a steady hand. Inside were just a few lines, written in the cold. Elegant hand of a man named Elias Ward, a banker from the capital, and once a partner in Weston's empire. "You left debts behind when you walked away, Weston. The law doesn't forget, and neither do I. I'll be visiting soon. You'd best settle what you owe." Weston's hand tightened around the paper. Elias Ward wasn't coming for money. He was coming for revenge. That night, Weston drank more than he should have. He sat by the fire staring at the flames, the letter burning to ash between his fingers. Clara found him there long after midnight, the bottle half empty and his eyes lost somewhere far away. "Weston," she whispered, "what is it?" He didn't answer at first. Then, with a sigh that carried years of ghosts, he said, "A man I once called a friend. I did things I'm not proud of, Clara. I hurt people. Took what wasn't mine. You were young," she said softly. "No," he replied. "I was greedy, and men like that don't get to grow old in peace." Clara kneeled beside him, placing a hand over his. "You've changed," he shook his head, smiling bitterly. "Maybe, but the past doesn't care about change." For a long while, neither spoke. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dark. Then Clara said, "Whatever comes, you won't face it alone." He turned to her, eyes raw, vulnerable, almost pleading. You should have run the day I brought you here. Maybe, she said. But then I wouldn't have found home. Days later, the storm arrived, not from the sky this time, but from the road. A dust cloud rose as a line of riders approached, 6 men strong, led by Elias Ward himself, a man with polished boots, a serpent's smile, and a revolver too clean to have known mercy. The ranch hands froze. Clara was carrying feed to the stables when she saw them. Weston stepped out from the main house, hand resting on his gun belt, face carved from stone. "Ward," he called out. "Hail," Elias replied, dismounting with a grin. "Still hiding behind all that gold?" "You came a long way," Weston said. "Say what you came to say." Elias tilted his head. "Oh, I'm not here to talk. You owe me land and blood, and I hear you've got something precious these days." His eyes shifted toward Clara. Weston's jaw tightened. "Leave her out of this." "Oh, I will," Elias said, smirking. "After she watches you fall." Without warning, Elias drew his pistol, but Weston was faster. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the ranch, birds scattering from the trees. Elias stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. His men drew their weapons, chaos erupting like a storm breaking all at once. Clara screamed. Bullets tore through the air, shattering the calm that had held for too long. The ranch hands dove for cover. Weston fired again and again, moving with the precision of a man who danced with death before. When the smoke began to clear, 3 of Ward's men lay in the dust. The others fled, dragging their wounded leader with them. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara ran toward Weston. Blood was running down his arm, a crimson thread that stained his shirt. "You're hurt," she cried, reaching for him. "It's nothing," he said, his breath ragged. "I've had worse." "You'll sit down, Weston Hale, or I swear I'll drag you there myself." Her tone was fierce, more command than plea, and for once, Weston obeyed. She tore a strip from her dress, pressed it against the wound, her hands trembling. He winced, but his eyes never left her face. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. "Because I love you," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. "Because somewhere between hating you and forgiving you, I fell for you." Weston froze. For a man who'd faced bullets and betrayal, nothing had ever hit him harder. He reached up, his hand finding her cheek, rough and gentle all at once. "You shouldn't love a man like me." "Then tell me to stop," she whispered. He couldn't. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the space between them. The kiss came slow, hesitant, as if both were afraid the world would break if they moved too fast. But when it came, it was everything the West wasn't: warm, forgiving, alive. That night, the ranch was quiet again. The moon climbed over the hills, silvering the fields. Weston sat on the porch, his arm bandaged, Clara resting her head against his shoulder. "He'll come back," she said. "Let him," Weston replied. "This time, I won't be the man he remembers." "And who will you be?" He looked at her, eyes soft. "A man with something to lose." She smiled, taking his hand. "Then you've already won." The next days were peaceful. Weston rode the fences again, stronger each morning. Clara took over the garden, planting flowers where bullets had fallen. The men worked in silence, respecting the quiet bond between their boss and the girl who had somehow tamed him. But one evening, as the sun bled across the sky, Weston found Clara sitting by the river, the same place they'd stood weeks ago. "You came back," he said. "I always do," she smiled. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "I've spent my life chasing gold, land, respect, and none of it ever felt like mine. But you—" He turned to her. "You feel like something I earned right." Her eyes shone. "You didn't earn me, Weston. You saved me, and I saved you back." He took her hand. The world around them quieted, the wind, the river, even the birds. "You're not my debt anymore, Clara Turner," he whispered. "You're my forever." The first light of morning stretched over the horizon like a ribbon of gold, painting the Hale Ranch in warmth and quiet promise. The air smelled of wet earth and wildflowers, mingling with the faint tang of hay and leather from the barns. For the first time in months, the ranch felt alive in a different way, not with work or fear, but with possibility. Clara walked along the riverbank. boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, tracing patterns in the shallow water. The sky above reflected the soft pinks and purples of dawn, each cloud a delicate brushstroke across an endless canvas. There was a serenity in the moment, yet underneath it, a pulse of change thrummed, a reminder that life, once broken, could be rebuilt. Weston appeared at the edge of the clearing, every step deliberate, a quiet strength moving through him. His gaze lingered on the figure by the river, a mixture of awe and gratitude shadowing his eyes. Words seemed unnecessary. The space between them carried more weight than any speech. Finally, a soft voice broke the morning calm. "The river looks different today." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "It changes with the light," he replied. "Much like us, I suppose. No need for formalities." Years of struggle, of fear, of silence had faded. Every moment that had led them here, every storm endured, every danger faced, had built the foundation for this. The land itself seemed to acknowledge it, the wind gentle, the leaves whispering approval. Clara turned to face him fully, eyes catching the shimmer of the sun on water. "I never imagined life could feel like this." A confession that carried relief, joy, and a quiet wonder all at once. Weston's hand reached for hers, not as a question, but as a promise. Fingers intertwined, firm and reassuring, grounding both hearts. "We've earned it," came the simple truth. "Everything we've fought for, everything we've survived. It led to this." The moment stretched, each heartbeat echoing across the riverbank, before laughter spilled quietly between them, soft and unrestrained. There was no need for hesitation, no room for past shadows, only the present and the future waiting to be written together. Later, in the heart of the ranch, the house bustled gently, not with chaos or fear, but with life returning to a place that had known both. Ranch hands moved with ease, a new respect for the man who had finally allowed his heart to open, and the woman who had quietly claimed it. Flowers bloomed along the paths, small signs of care planted by hands once raw with work, but now tender in purpose. A simple ceremony followed that afternoon by the river. Friends and workers gathered under the open sky, the horizon stretching endlessly behind them. No grand church, no velvet gowns, no gilded halls, just honest earth beneath their boots, the wind carrying promises and laughter, the sun blessing every step. Vows were spoken quietly, not as ritual, but as truths laid bare. Words of loyalty, of courage, of love forged in storms and trials. Rings exchanged were symbols of more than wealth or status. They were proof of endurance, of hearts willing to risk everything for the right person. As the sun dipped low, the couple stood side by side, looking out over the fields, the rivers, the horses grazing in calm. The world had been vast and cruel, yet it now seemed a canvas for what could be beautiful when two hearts aligned. Weston leaned close, his voice almost a whisper against the gentle wind. "No debts left to collect, only a life to live." Clara's hand tightened around his, "and a future to build together." The sky deepened into twilight, stars beginning to pierce the fading light. The ranch, the river, the hills all bore witness to a story of redemption, courage, and love that had survived the fiercest trials. For the first time, Weston Hale allowed himself to believe in more than power or fear. He believed in mercy, in hope, in the quiet strength of a woman who had changed him more than any fortune or legacy ever could. And Clara Turner, once the daughter of a man in debt, once a girl unsure of her place in the world, now stood as an equal partner in a life that neither had dared to dream. The world would always hold danger, storms, and shadows. But at that moment, under the vast sky of the West, two hearts had found their home. And that above all else was enough. If you were in Clara's shoes, would you have accepted the Cowboy's offer or walked away? Comment below and tell us why. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more untold tales from the Wild West.